Mark chapter 6, beginning at verse 14. Now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Others said, it is Elijah, and others said, it is the prophet, or one like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, this is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John, and bound him in prison, for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things, and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came, when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. He also swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. So she went out and asked her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought, and he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Father, thank you. Just thank you that we can gather in your name, in this place, freely, that at least for a time we can still speak your word without the fear of the same fate as our brother John. Help us to be bold with your word. Help us to respond when you speak to our hearts. We ask that you would just clean this place, that if any evil that's found its way in here would just be cast out. This is your house. You own it. It belongs to you. Fill it to overflowing with your Holy Spirit. And all this I ask in the beautiful and blessed name of Jesus. Amen. So, we're going to get a little, we're going to dig into some history here, but I think it'll help you down the road. I know it has seriously helped me figure out why are there so many Herods in the Bible. And so we're going to sort out who some of those people are. 3 weeks back, we saw Jesus in Nazareth, where for the second time he is rejected. Jesus does not fold or even waver in the face of this rejection, but simply continues on to the next town with his message. As he moves about, we are told that he sees the broken people wandering about like lost sheep without a shepherd, and is moved to his innermost being to help them. Limited by the human body in which he dwells, Jesus chooses now is the time to take those men whom he has been teaching and modeling how to spread the gospel of the kingdom to, and send them out as emissaries of the kingdom. Before sending them out to preach and heal, Jesus instructs them as to what they are to do, where they are to go, what they need for their journey, how they will be provided for on their journey, and how to deal with those who receive them and those who do not. Jesus then went on to detail the persecution that they would encounter, or that would eventually come their way as a result of standing with Christ. And it is not a pretty picture. The gospel of Jesus is so offensive to some that they will attack, imprison, and murder those who try to spread the gospel. The gospel is so offensive to some, they will turn against those of their very own family rather than hear it. Finally, we looked ahead at to the time when the persecution that Jesus foretold of did come in the book of Acts of the Apostles. And we saw how Jesus is foretelling of coming prophecy, of the coming persecution, and the fact that the disciples went anyway, and then once it came, continued to their deaths to proclaim the gospel of Christ, is perhaps the most compelling evidence in existence that the resurrection actually occurred. So Jesus has multiplied his efforts to spread the good news of the coming of the kingdom. Instead of just one large contingency, there is one large group and 6 smaller groups working simultaneously now to spread the good news of the coming of the kingdom and to minister to the needs of the sick, the broken, and the enslaved. This week, we see what may appear to be an aside in the narrative of the life and ministry of Jesus. Meanwhile, back in Herod's castle, while this event is not per se part of Jesus' narrative, its timing and placement serves a huge purpose. And we'll talk about this when we get to the end. As we just read the event we are looking at today, it's the murder of John the Baptizer, herald of the Messiah. In some ways, this is, if not the close of the Old Testament, it's a closing of the Old Testament. If the whole gist of the Old Testament was to point to the coming of the Messiah, and the prophets of the Old Testament all prophesied about that event, then John the Baptizer was the last of the Old Testament prophets. And he had the distinct honor of not only prophesying about the coming of the Messiah, but lived to see the arrival of that Messiah and got to introduce him to the world. Today's event, we see 4 main characters. One, John the Baptizer, which we've talked about a lot, so I'm not going to go into his. Next would be Herod Antipas, called Herod the King, Herodias, the wife of Herod Antipas, and Salome, the daughter of Herodias. And there's such a huge backstory behind this event. So to see that backdrop, we're going to do some history. Let's look at each of these characters and where they come from, who they are. First on the list, Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas, you may need to write some of this down, flow charts, it's twisted. Herod Antipas was the son, direct descendant of Herod the Great. Herod the Great was a bloodthirsty, paranoid man who had unseated the Hasmonean dynasty. That was the last ethnic Jews to rule over Israel. Herod the Great was responsible for the murder of the innocents in Bethlehem shortly after the birth of Jesus. Now, Herod the Great was ethnically an Edomite. He was not a Jew. The Edomites were conquered by the Hasmonean dynasty and forced to either convert to Judaism or die. So Herod the Great was raised in the Jewish religion but had no Jewish blood. While he claimed to be Jewish, his lifestyle showed no signs that that was true. And he was, by and large, hated by the Jews. Herod Antipas's mother, who looked at his father, was Malthrace, and she was a Samaritan. The other group that was forced by the Hasmoneans to either convert or die. She was also the mother of Herod Archelaus, the older brother of Herod Antipas. She died in Rome in 4 BC while her 2 sons were fighting over their father's will before Caesar Augustus. Antipas, the character in today's story, his full brother Archelaus and his half-brother Philip were all educated in Rome by the Romans. They went and were part of the court of Caesar Augustus, and they were educated out of there. They lived in Caesar Augustus's palace and homes, and like they were one of them. Now Antipas was not Herod's first choice for heir. The honor actually fell to Aristobulus and Alexander, Herod's sons by his second wife, the Hasmonean princess Marianne, or Miriam. It was only after he was executed in 7 BC and Herod's oldest son Antipater was convicted of trying to poison his father in 5 BC that the now elderly Herod fell back on his youngest son Antipas, revising his will to make him heir. During another illness, a year later in 4 BC, Herod had yet another change of heart about the succession. According to the final version of his will, Antipas's elder brother Archelaus, by yet another mother, was now to be, Herod had like 9 wives and a bunch of chicks on the side too. So it was, so Archelaus is now to become the king of Judea. He was the one in power when Jesus' family came back and they said, yeah, we're not going to go because he was as big a nutburger as his father was. So he got Judea, Idumea, and Samaria, while Antipas would rule Galilee and Perea with the lesser title of Tetrarch, and Philip was to receive Galantis, or the Golan Heights, Batanea, southern Syria, and Trachonitis, and Aurantis, or Haran. And I'm not positive where all those places are. And actually it was split up 4 ways. There was a sister that got a little tiny piece of something down, basically where the Gaza Strip is right now. She got Philistine land. Because of Judea's status as a Roman client kingdom, Herod's plans for the succession had to be ratified by Augustus. The 3 heirs therefore traveled to Rome to make their claims. Antipas arguing he ought to inherit the whole kingdom, and the others maintaining that Herod's final will ought to be honored. Despite qualified support for Antipas from the rest of his family members in Rome, who favored direct Roman rule of Judea but considered Antipas preferable to his brother Augustus, largely confirmed the division of territory set out by Herod in his final will. Archelaus had, however, to be content with the title of Entrarch, because he got more pieces, rather than king. Nobody got to actually be called king. So it would appear that Herod Antipas was far from being his father's favorite son. After being recognized by Augustus upon the death of his father Herod the Great, and subsequent Entrarch rule of his brother Herod Archelaus, Antipas officially ruled Galilee and Perea as a client state of the Roman Empire. He was responsible for building projects at Sepphoris, which had been the capital of the Galilee region, but he's going to change that, and Beth Aramphtha, and more important, for the construction of his capital city in the Galilee area, Tiberias, which is located on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's where most people stay when they go to the Galilee region, because really it's the only town on the Sea of Galilee. And it's named in honor of his patron, the Emperor Tiberius. The city later became a center for rabbinic learning, which is really ironic, considering the history of Tiberius. And this is sort of a little aside, but it was too interesting to leave out. Tiberias was the capital city of Herod Antipas's, so making it the most important city in all of Galilee region, and yet Jesus never went there. This is the biggest town in the entire Galilee region, period. Jesus never went there. There's no record of it. The history of the city may give us a clue why. The city of Tiberias was built on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, so named for his patron. So, by the time it was finished, residents could bathe nearby at the warm springs of Emmaus, and by the time of the First Jewish-Roman War, the city's own building included a stadium, a royal palace, and a sanctuary for prayer. It gave its name to the sea. Quite often the Sea of Galilee is called the Sea of Tiberias. In fact, it's called that in the Bible in places. Now it eventually becomes the center for rabbinic learning, but at first Herod could not get any Jews to live there because he had built it atop a graveyard. And therefore anybody who went there would become ritually impure. Antipas had to colonize it using a mixture of foreigners, forced migrants, poor people, and freed slaves. So perhaps Jesus, being a good Jewish boy, avoided this city because he knew he would be considered ritually impure. This guy is Herod Antipas, who bore the title of Tetrarch, ruler of a quarter, as it is referred to. In the Bible, he's referred to both as Herod the Tetrarch and Herod the King. Although he technically never held the title of king, Herod would constantly seek to be granted the title of king by Rome throughout the entirety of his 42-year reign. Every time he was in there, he said, "Hey, isn't it about time for me to King Herod doesn't have a nice ring to King Herod," and they wouldn't do it. Some commentators say that the gospel writer's use of the title of King Herod in the gospel accounts may have actually been a slight against Antipas. King Herod. That kind of a shot at him because he had so vehemently sought the title but was never actually granted it. Early in his reign, Antipas had married Phasaeus, the daughter of King Aretas IV of Nabatea. Nabatea, now I should have got out the map. If you picture the Sea of Galilee, and Galilee being to this side, and then down out of the Sea of Galilee is the Jordan River. His other area, Perea, ran fat and wide right along what would be the eastern side of the Jordan River. Nabatea was right to the other side of that. So it would be in modern day Jordan. Now his marriage, so he marries Phasaeus, king Aretas' daughter. However, on a visit to Rome, he stayed with his half-brother Herod II, also known as Herod Philip I, not to be confused with Philip the Tetrarch, who owned the area on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or ruled over it. Rome owned it all. So he's staying with Philip I. He's on a trip to Rome. "Hey, bro, I need a place to stay." He lets him in, and what happens? There he falls in love with Herod II's wife, Herodias, and the two agreed to marry after Herod Antipas divorced his wife. He actually absconded with the woman. I mean, he grabbed her and took off. Antipas's divorce would eventually lead to his downfall. His marriage to Phasaeus had helped to quell a territorial dispute between Antipas and King Aretas, Phasaeus' father. Once Antipas had divorced her and she was safely returned to her homeland, King Aretas waged war on Antipas, and the fallout eventually led to his being removed as Tetrarch by Rome. One really bad decision. Herod Antipas was a deeply conflicted man. He was raised in and around the Jewish faith, although he was ethnically descended from people who were sworn enemies of the Jewish people and faith. So he had this ethnic pull and this cultural pull of the religion. Although he ruled over Jewish people and was steeped in their culture and faith, he was educated in Greco-Roman schools and culture and constantly was seeking the favor of Rome, which left him in a constant state of trying to please two diametrically opposed factions, those who ruled over the Jews and those whose endorsement he needed to stay in power, which was Rome. Herodias. This lady is, wow. Herodias is the second wife of Herod Antipas and the main protagonist in these events. She is the daughter of Aristobulus. Aristobulus was one of the two sons of Herod that was with his wife Miriam and was killed because they thought Herod had this thing. If he thought you were out, Herod the Great, the saying amongst the Romans was that it was safer to be Herod's pig than a member of his family. Herod didn't eat pigs because he was Jewish, but he might eat one of his own. So, his sons by Miriam, who was the Hasmonean princess. So this woman is a quarter Jew. She actually has Jewish blood on her father's side. Her mother is Bernice, who was the daughter of Herod the Great's sister, Salome the First. So her parents were first cousins. It gets worse. After her father was executed by her grandfather, Herod the Great, he gave her to his son Herod II, aka Herod Philip, as a wife. So she married her half-uncle first. Her full brother is Herod Agrippa I. He will take over his uncle Philip the Tetrarch's territory in the north and eventually unseat Antipas from power and be granted control over his territories. Eventually he will also be granted rule over Judea, thus reuniting almost all of his grandfather Herod the Great's kingdom under one rule again. Herod Agrippa I, brother to Herodias, is the King Herod of Acts chapter 12, who killed the apostle James and imprisoned Peter, intending to kill him as well. In verse 22, he is hailed as a god. In verse 24, he is eaten by worms and dies for accepting glory that belonged to God. So that Herod is the brother-in-law of this Herod. But they're all related. Now Herod Agrippa I has one son and 3 daughters. His son Herod Agrippa II was 17 at the time of his father's death at the hands of the worms. So he was kept in Rome, and control of his father's territories was put in the hands of a Roman procurator or governor. He would eventually be made king and rule over portions, a very small portion of his father's territories, including Jerusalem. Agrippa II, the Agrippa that died of the worms, his son had 3 sisters. One of them was named Drusilla. Her second husband was Felix, the procurator or governor over parts of Israel. The Apostle Paul will share the gospel with Felix and Drusilla in Acts 24:24. Agrippa II had another sister named Bernice, after the grandmother, with whom it was rumored that he was having an incestuous relationship. Paul would give his testimony before Agrippa II, called King Herod or Agrippa, Bernice, and Governor Festus, and famously almost persuade Herod Agrippa II to convert to Christianity in Acts 26. So Agrippa II, the nephew of Herodias, would be the last member of the Herod family to rule over any part of Israel. So at this point, Herodias is simultaneously the niece and sister-in-law of Herod Antipas when he falls for her. I told you, this is ugly. This is really ugly. That leaves Salome. She's simply called Herodias' daughter in this passage. We know her name to be Salome through the writings of Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was, by the way, a very close friend of Agrippa II. So he got all of this family dynamic hodgepodge thingamajiggy right from the source. So we can, in a lot of ways, we can trust a lot of what Josephus tells us because he got it from such a good source. Now, Salome was the daughter of Herodias and her first husband, Herod II, aka Herod Philip. Now, Salome would later marry Philip the Tetrarch, half-brother of her father Herod II, and thus her half-uncle. After his death, she would marry Aristobulus of Chalcis, who ruled over a very small section of what would later be part of the province of Syria. He was a great-grandson of Herod the Great through both his mother and his father. Salome would be a granddaughter of Herod the Great on her father's side and a great-granddaughter of Herod the Great on her mother's side. They had 3 children together, all of which had 4 eyes and 6 ears. As you can see, the family tree of Herod is basically a trunk. Every time it tries to branch off, it just circles back on itself. At the time this event occurred, Salome was simultaneously Herod Antipas's niece and stepdaughter. This is a sordid backstory, the sordid backstory behind the events that we are looking at. A family that is beset with incestuous relationships made in an unbridled effort to get and maintain power. That's what all of this is about. We don't want to share the money. We don't want to share the power. She's kind of cute. I'll take her. And it consolidates power. Now, the events we look at today are also recorded in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. So, beginning in verse 14. Now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Now, Jesus is nearing the 3rd Passover of his ministry. They pace out or time out the length of Jesus' ministry by the number of feasts that he partook in. The first Passover that Jesus takes part in his ministry was when he cleansed the temple. It was during that first Passover of his ministry. The 4th Passover will be the day of his murder. He was murdered on the 4th Passover. So this being the 3rd ministry, Jesus is now roughly approximately 2.5 years into his ministry. And Herod Antipas is just now hearing about Jesus. He's been preaching, teaching, healing, liberating, raising people from the dead, and upsetting the Jewish religious leaders for over 2 years. And word of him is just now reaching the ears of Herod Antipas. This would imply that Herod Antipas's world is far removed from the man on the street. The very people he is supposed to be ruling over. Jesus is turning the world outside his palace upside down, and it does not make it into his radar for 2.5 years. Now, when he does hear about it, what's his reaction? Oh, it must be John the Baptist come back to life. John had performed no miracles during his lifetime. None. But Antipas somehow believes that since John was murdered and came back, that with his resurrection he had received powers to carry out miracles. This is what happens within a mind racked by the guilt of sins they have committed. When you don't really believe in God, what you have to fall back on to explain the miraculous? Folklore and superstition. Things you make up in your own mind. Verse 15, others said it's Elijah, and others said it's the prophet or like one of the prophets. Many people, since the day Jesus hit the scene, people are speculating, who is this upstart rabbi from Nazareth? Who might he really be? The prophets had foretold that Elijah, who did not die, but was taken up into heaven in a fiery chariot, would return just before the coming of the Messiah. That was a well-known prophecy. But that is the second coming of the Messiah. This is the first coming, the suffering servant Messiah, who would be preceded by a herald, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the ways of the Lord. That would be John the Baptizer, the guy Antipas had just killed. The prophet, this is a prophecy of Moses, who said that God one day would send one like him, like me. One day God will send one like me, and him you will listen to. For some reason, there's this disconnect amongst the Jews. They don't see that this prophet that Moses predicted and prophesied about was actually the Messiah. I don't know. I haven't seen that until where that started. But somehow there's this disconnect. A lot of Jews believed that there was the prophet that was promised by Messiah, by Moses, and then there was the Messiah, and they didn't see them as one and the same people. And in fact, the people of Israel will not fully turn to Jesus until the second coming. In fact, he's completely and wildly rejected at this point, so this cannot possibly be that prophet. Close but no cigar. And other than those two, trying to fit Jesus into these two prophecies, which are both valid but are being misapplied, other than that, people just simply consider Jesus a prophet in the vein of Elijah or Elisha, a spokesman for God who could work miracles similar to what they could. But he's so far exceeded anything they ever did. And these were the common misconceptions as to the identity of Jesus among the people of Israel. In fact, the disciples, this is so pervasive that the disciples will give these very same answers when Jesus asks them, who do men say that I am, in Caesarea Philippi. That's in Mark 16:13 and Matthew 16:13 and Mark 8:27. Verse 16, but when Herod heard, he said, this is John whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. Herod dismisses any opposing explanation. The paranoia of his guilty conscience simply will not allow him to see anything other than what has implanted itself in his own brain. Verse 17, for Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. So at this point, the author goes back in time. We look at an after effect, and now the author goes back in time to look at the events that led up to it. We don't know exactly how far. Probably it was as short as a few days earlier. Maybe it can't be more than a week or two. And explain how it came to be that John the Baptizer was beheaded at the hands of Herod Antipas. The narrative begins with John being thrown in prison. And please note this, John was locked up to please Antipas's new wife, Herodias, who had been his brother Philip's wife. Verses 18 and 19, because John said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. This is why John is in prison, because he had the nerve to tell the king that what he had done was not right in the eyes of God. That's it, in a nutshell. That's why John is locked up in prison. And John was not speaking out of his hat. The Word of God backs him up. Leviticus 18:16. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness. Leviticus 20:21. If a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. Herod Antipas, while not an ethnic Jew, was supposedly an adherent of the Jewish faith. And here he is blatantly violating God's commandment. He is also ruling over a predominantly Jewish population. God puts men in seats of power and expects them to set the example for those that they rule over. If the head pig at the trough, by example, says it's okay to willy-nilly divorce your wife and then marry your brother's wife, whom you've encouraged to divorce your brother, then what does that say to those he rules over? As a prophet of God, John had every right to call the king out for his flagrant flaunting of the very laws he was supposed to enforce. John is in prison because he had the nerve to tell a man in power that he is a sinner. Please notice, it does not say that Herod himself was upset with what John had said. There's no indication of that. No, the person who is offended is his wife. In fact, she is so offended she wants John dead. This woman's heart is as hard as they come. The correct response to having your sin exposed is to repent and ask for forgiveness. Instead, this woman wants the appointed messenger of God who pointed out her misdeed to be silenced permanently. Now, while it says she wanted John dead, it says she couldn't make it happen. Why? Verse 20. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. And this is the reason Herodias could not kill John outright. It would appear that despite how terribly flawed this man was, he had a conscience. It's tiny. It's not real big. It's highly compromised. He's willing to do things a lot of other people wouldn't do it, but he does have a conscience. His marriage to Herodias, he knew it was wrong, but he was willing to compromise. Locking up John, he knows it's wrong, but he's willing to do it. The human conscience, however small it is, it's a gift from God. It is what keeps humans from descending into utter depravity. If it weren't for that little voice in the back of your head placed by God that goes, this is just not right, imagine what man would be capable. We see it when people are able to really beat that conscience down, and Herod Antipas is quickly approaching that point. Man is capable of some incredibly wicked things. A lot of people, some people, philosophers and psychologists, and will try to tell you that the human consciousness is nothing more than a construct of society or evolutionary forces. Well, it's good when you don't kill everybody, so that helped the man progress, and so it's an evolutionary force. Or societal pressure has placed on this, and frankly, these people are just wrong. God wrote his law on the man every heart. The Bible tells us that. And that's what keeps man from descending into utter depravity. It would seem from this passage that Antipas and John actually developed some type of relationship. Antipas would visit John in prison and gladly heard what he would tell him and acted on the things that he would tell him. Despite all of this, John remains in prison when he should be a free man. The problem is that Antipas is willing to compromise what he knows to be wrong. He has a fatal flaw, and that is about to be exploited by someone close to him, and it will lead to his ultimate destruction. This
this is a battle being waged for this man's soul. It's literally the classic picture. A messenger of God on one shoulder and a demon, a messenger of Satan sitting on the other, literally. The messenger of God is John, who is urging Antipas to do what is right in the sight of God. And the messenger of Satan is Herodias, who is urging him to silence the voice of God in his life. They are battling on a spiritual level for the soul of Herod Antipas. Verse 21. Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. It says that an opportune day came. Opportune for Herodias. She knew Antipas's fatal flaw, and she sees this as the opportune moment to exploit it and get Antipas to do exactly what she wants him to do. It is Antipas's birthday, and he throws a big party where he is surrounded by all the prominent men that he rules over. Historians tell us that in this period, birthday parties were a Gentile custom. This shows us that Herod Antipas and his men were thoroughly Hellenized. Those who were invited, especially by a man of Antipas's stature, were expected to attend. And those parties typically included excessive drinking. This is just all the makings of a horrible, horrible train wreck of a life. Verse 22. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." So Herodias sets this plot in motion. She is trying to bait her husband into doing what she wants him to do. She is setting a trap, and the bait in the trap is her own daughter. It is only implied in the text, but historians tell us that this was not a young lass doing a ballet recital for her stepfather and his friends. No, basically this is a burlesque show. Normally a prostitute would be hired or a concubine would be pressed into doing a dance like this. This is not something the member of a royal family would ever do. Never. This is how far Herodias was willing to sink to get her way. To prostitute, in a sense, her own daughter to seduce her husband into committing murder. Historians and commentators tell us that this young girl, Salome, was likely between the age of 12 and 14 and may already have been betrothed to her uncle Philip the Tetrarch, which further still illustrates the depravity of her mother. And it's a brilliantly evil plan. The thing I get, I have to see I'd be willing to bet anything that this woman, this girl, Salome, looked exactly like her mother. That's the hook. Her husband is all liquored up and wanting to show off in front of his friends, so I'll send in this younger, fresher version of myself and get him all turned on. He was willing to betray his own family to have me. There's no telling what he might offer her. And it worked. Antipas fell headfirst into her trap. Antipas is drunk, aroused, and looking to show off in front of his friends, so he offers the girl a gift. And I have to wonder at this point, didn't he recognize this girl? If this was my daughter, even my stepdaughter, I would run out and pull off my own robe and throw it over, get her out of here. Who's responsible for this? This girl is royalty. She's not a streetwalker. Is he that drunk that he does not recognize her? Or is he so depraved that he just doesn't care? I'm not sure. Verse 23, he also swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half my kingdom. The trap is set and sprung, and Antipas swears he will give her anything she asks. Matthew's account tells us he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. He has no idea what he has just opened himself up to. Verse 24, so she went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. The fact that the girl goes out and asks her mother to ask what to ask for shows that she's not in on the plot beforehand. She may be the most innocent person in this picture, but not that innocent. The question to her mother is asked in the middle voice, implying that she was thinking of asking of something for herself, and had only come to her mother for advice on making that choice. She's completely unprepared for what her mother is about to tell her. And this woman is straight up evil. She could have just simply asked, I want John dead. No, she wants his head on a platter. I want a trophy. And I think this is as much to embarrass her husband for not taking John's life earlier when she wanted him to, as it is to silence John. Because having him in prison, that's basically accomplished already. Who's he going to tell? He's in prison. No, she's... This woman is in bad shape. Verse 25, immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Now, how scary must Herodias be for a young girl of 12, 13, or 14 to do that at her best? Think of most girls at that age, if you ask them to do something like that. Oh no, I'm not asking for that. What's wrong with you? No, I'm not. If you want that, you go ask him. I'm not having any part of this. And yet, she, or perhaps this woman was raising her daughter to be the same kind of wicked, manipulative viper that she was. Either way, this woman is frightening. And it says the daughter with haste does as she commands. Verse 26. And the king was exceedingly sorry because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him. He did not want to refuse her. And the king was exceedingly sorry. Now, some commentators say that the reason that Antipas is exceedingly sorry is the same reason he had not executed John already. Because he feared that the people would riot. Basically, they held John in this high esteem, and if he killed him, the people would riot, so he kept John alive because of political expedience. If it were not for verse 20, I would agree with that statement because it would make the most sense. What verse 20 tells us, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things, and heard him gladly. Antipas was exceedingly sorry because he knew that taking the life of God's messenger was wrong. And yet, he is going to do it anyway. Why? Because he made an oath, a promise in front of his friends. Had he gone back on his oath, it would be considered shameful. Apparently it's not shameful to behead a prophet, but it is shameful to go back on a promise to behead a prophet. Basically, Antipas was afraid of what his friends might say about him if he reneged on his promise. And this right here is Antipas's fatal flaw. Pride. pride is what set all of this in motion. It was pride that said, I can take my brother's wife. I am so important that what is right and what is wrong does not apply to me. I can just take what I want. I want her, I will have her. It was pride that kept Antipas from repenting when John pointed out his sin. Herodias knew that Antipas was a proud man, and she just played him like a conductor leading an orchestra. And the devil does the same thing to us every day. When we are prideful, he uses it and pulls us by the people. These proud people, they think, I am master of my own domain. I am God of my own world. I do what I please. I am the be-all, the end-all. And that very pride is like a ring in their nose, and the devil just drags them all over town with it. It's so easy to play a truly proud person. It just takes, if you want to get him to do something, appeal to his pride. If you want to insult him, hit him in his pride. Verses 27 and 28. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. I started thinking about all the gruesome events in the Bible, and this one has to be up there near the top. I mean, we got one guy who had a spike drove through his head while he was sleeping after some woman gave him some milk and he got off, wanted a nap. And then we had the king that was so fat that when he stabbed him, the blubber came out and recovered the... I mean, there's some gruesome stuff in the Bible. But this has got to be near the top, if not the most. And it was all set in motion when one man allowed his pride to override his conscience. He chose what he wanted over what he knew to be right. Verse 29, when his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Matthew's account tells us that after placing John's body in the tomb, they went and told Jesus what had happened. And so passes the last of the Old Testament prophets. John the Baptizer meets the fate of so many who came before him. He is murdered for telling people the word of God. While this event is not directly related to Jesus' ministry, he really plays no part in anything that happens here. The timing of this event and its placement within the gospel record is especially poignant. It is a brilliant illustration of what Jesus had just told his disciples. In fact, there are a bunch of ways that we can directly pick statements made by Jesus to his disciples in their commissioning and show them carried out in this vignette. I want to look at two. There are more. There are lots more, but I want to look at two. One, in Matthew 10:18, Jesus says, "You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles." John was in prison because that is where God wanted him to be, so that he could give Antipas the same message he was giving to the people. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. We saw earlier how completely removed from everyday life, everyday people that Antipas was. It took 2.5 years for him to hear about Jesus. He had no idea what was happening with the man down on the street. This was the only way he would ever hear the message that God had sent John to give. And it's easy to, wow, that's unfair. Why did John have to, he didn't even get saved. John is not up in heaven lamenting his time in prison or the loss of his head, I promise you. Guarantee it. John is in heaven praising God that he was God's chosen instrument of grace towards Antipas. It is only because of God's grace that there is a message of redemption to be told, and it is only because of his grace that people are sent out, even at the cost of their own lives, to spread that message. We have no idea the people he could have affected in prison. We know it was to get the gospel message to Antipas, but we have no idea the other people that he could have affected on the way. And John is rejoicing in heaven that he was that chosen vessel, I promise you. If you don't believe me, get saved, go to heaven, and ask him. I promise you it's true. 2. The second one is more subtle. And the person I'm going to apply this one to is probably not your first choice, but it definitely fits. Jesus said in Matthew 10:39, "He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it." So there's a positive and a negative statement within what Jesus has said right here. The positive is, he who loses his life for my sake will find it. And there's the obvious illustration in this text. John lost his life in a literal sense for the cause of Christ. And now that Jesus has bore the cross and been resurrected, John is in the presence of God the Father. He has found true life, eternal life with God. But there's also a negative statement in what Jesus said. He who finds his life will lose it. Herod Antipas has done everything possible to make or find a life for himself in this world. And his love of this world and the pleasures of this world have cost him the only life that really matters, the life of his soul. Out of pride, Antipas has chosen the praise of men and pleasure over the things of God. And he cannot claim that he did not know. For God, in his grace, had reached out through John to him and urged him, please, turn from this wickedness. Now, I titled this message, "The Death of the Herald's Messiah." And it's the obvious title. Everybody knows what we're getting into. But I strongly considered titling this message, "Flirting with God." Antipas had only locked up John to placate his wife, to shut her up. This text tells us that he himself feared John, for he knew that John was a holy and just man. It would seem from the text that Antipas, despite John having called him out for his action, was actually drawn to John. He visited him in prison and he heard the things that he said gladly and acted in accordance to some of the things John had told him. On some level, he acknowledges and believes in God. It's the only explanation for calling John a holy and just man. But he's only flirting with God. We see other examples of this in the Bible. Saul flirted with God in the prophet God. When it was convenient for him, he kept Samuel around and did what he told him to do. And when it was inconvenient, he did what he wanted to do. And his sin was the same. It was pride. I think of people, skipping forward 1,700 years, I think of people like Benjamin Franklin, who by most historical accounts was a cunning statesman and had a brilliant mind for science, but he was also given to debauchery. He liked to drink a lot and was also a serial philanderer with multiple girlfriends in every city he spent time in. When he was ambassador to France, Paris was his oyster. He had chicks stashed all over the place. Here in the States, in Philadelphia, where he called home, he had women all over the place. In Washington, D.C., where he went to, he had women all over the place. He was a serial philanderer. This, despite being raised in a Puritan, I couldn't believe this one, a Puritan Episcopalian home. But But once he was exposed to the ideas and philosophies of the Enlightenment period, he fancied himself a deist. Most shocking, perhaps, was Franklin's lifelong friendship with English preacher George Whitefield, considered by most the voice of the Great Awakening. They wrote letters back and forth on regular occasions, and Franklin supported Whitefield's efforts to open an orphanage. Letters between these two men are actually displayed. I wanted to say the Smithsonian, but I don't think that there are museums that have these letters written between Whitefield and Franklin, and an avowed, a brilliant man of God, responsible for so many people. God worked through him to bring so many people to Christ and start so many churches, so many movements, so many organizations, and an avowed hedonist. While he loved Whitefield and thought that converting people to his brand of Christianity was a fine thing to do and would benefit society greatly, it's not really for me. He too flirted with God. In more modern times, we hear tales of high-ranking mobsters who are very close friends with and vehemently protected local priests in their churches and would contribute huge sums of money to keep the churches going. They too are simply flirting with God. And how many of us know people who don't mind or even kind of like being around Christians? Yeah, they think that they're good people and will go out of their way to help that godly Christian woman down the street whenever she needs some help. They may even listen attentively as you tell them about Jesus, but when you invite them to church or ask them if they want to make a decision, you just can't make it. They're flirting with God. And flirting with God is really, really dangerous. To hear the gospel and reject it or put it off over and over and over again does something inside of you. It slowly turns your heart to stone. Until you are so insensitive that you just can't respond to it. Antipas heard the gospel from John, I am positive of it. And despite what he knew of John and the truth of what he was saying, he would not respond. He would not repent. And then the devil put a choice in his lap and did everything he possibly could to make it difficult to choose God. He had passed over all of the easy opportunities to respond to God in John's prison cell. That was easy. Who's watching? What's on the line? God had him in a place where he could hear the message and easily accept it. But if he couldn't make the choice when the choosing was easy, what was he going to do when the choice was hard? He folded. And this choice sealed his fate. This choice was the one last rejection of God that so hardened his heart that when he only a short time later heard about the workings of Jesus, he would not see that this was the very Messiah that John had told him about. It must be John's ghost. He responded to the news about Jesus with paranoia out of a rock-hard heart that had slammed closed its door once and for all to the things of God. If you hear the call of the Savior in your ears today, respond now. You might not ever hear it again. Not because Jesus ever stops calling or showing himself to you. No, respond today because this rejection or this delay may be the one that so hardens your heart or closes your mind that you can no longer hear his call or see him when he is standing right in front of you.